The air in his office is heavy with power. She places the only thing she has left, her father's paper claim, on the vast mahogany desk between them. The man, William McCrae, doesn't even look at it. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, appraise her with cold contempt. "My dear girl," he says, his voice smooth as poison. "You don't have the proper color for this country. You're as pale as a ghost." The steam rose in a choking cloud, mingling with the alkaline tang of lye soap and the ever-present Nevada dust. Pearl McCain plunged another linen shirt into the scalding water, her arms aching from the elbow down, a deep, weary ache that had become as much a part of her as the rattle in her lungs. Each pull of the heavy, sodden fabric sent a jolt through her slight frame. Around her, the cacophony of Virginia City roared, the clang of a farrier's hammer, the rumble of ore wagons, the boisterous laughter spilling from a saloon. But in her small world of steam and suds, there was only the rhythmic slosh of water and the shallow rasp of her own breathing. A sudden gust of wind swept a veil of grit from the street, and the dust caught in her throat. The cough seized her without warning, a violent hacking tremor that doubled her over the washtub. It was a dry, consuming fit that offered no relief, only the agonizing clench of her chest. When she finally drew a ragged breath, she straightened slowly, her vision swimming. She did not need to look up to feel the eyes upon her. She felt them as a physical weight. The laundress beside her, pulling back with a tight-lipped frown. The man across the way, whose gaze was a mixture of pity and revulsion. Unclean, unfit. The words echoed in the hollows of her mind, a constant refrain against the fear that she was a burden, a fragile thing destined to be cast aside. That evening, in the quiet solitude of the small cabin her father had left her, the fear curdled into a familiar despair. Kneeling before his simple wooden trunk, she sorted through the last of his worldly possessions. The scent of pine and old wool rose from within. Beneath a worn wool coat, her fingers brushed against a folded brittle paper. Unfurling it with care, she saw the faded iron gall ink of an official claim document. Her father's name was there, alongside coordinates and a sworn statement testifying to a promising silver vein in the shadow of Mount Davidson. Hope, a terrifying and unfamiliar sensation, flickered within her chest. A claim. Her claim. But the flicker was almost immediately smothered by the cold truth of her own body. How could this frail skin, this failing vessel, ever hope to climb a mountain or work a mine? The paper in her hand felt as heavy as a headstone and as light as a dream. She drew the lamp closer, its meager flame casting a pool of wavering golden light upon the cabin's small table. The oil sputtered, a tiny rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. In this flickering illumination, the claim document seemed a living thing. Her fingers, stained with lye and raw at the knuckles, traced the faded lines of the surveyor's map. The paper felt impossibly fragile, a whisper of a thing, yet it held the weight of a mountain. Each marking, each notation of longitude and strata, was a testament to her father's last, desperate hope. His handwriting, once so bold and sure, was cramped in the margins, detailing the quality of the quartz and the promising blue tint of the ore. It was his story, written not in a diary, but upon the very earth of Nevada. And then she saw it, a notation at the bottom, not in her father's hand, but from the county clerk's office. A recent filing, cross-referencing this very parcel. The land, her father's legacy, was now registered under the sprawling domain of the Silver Consolidated Mining Company, a corporate behemoth whose local face was a man named William McCrae. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone. McCrae, a man whose ambition was as vast and unforgiving as the desert itself, a man who crushed smaller operations as a matter of course. Her father's dream had not simply faded, it had been devoured. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as the mountain air on a summer's day. She was 12 again, standing beside her father on a ridge overlooking the valley. He was not the gaunt, breathless man of her final memories, but vital and strong, the sun catching the silver threads in his dark hair. He had unrolled a similar, fresher map, his calloused finger pointing with unshakable pride. "See there, Pearl Girl?" His voice had boomed, full of life and promise, scattering a trio of curious chickadees. "That's not just rock and dirt. That's our future. No more taking orders. No more breaking our backs for another man's wealth. That's a foundation, a name, something to let you walk through this town with your head held high." A chill, born of the present, snaked up her spine. chasing the warmth of the memory away. The cabin felt colder, the silence more profound. Head high. The words mocked her. How could she hold her head high when she could barely lift it from her pillow some mornings? When the gazes of the townsfolk made her feel like a ghost, already buried, a fierce, defiant spark ignited within her. She would not be a ghost. This paper was more than a claim. It was a right. It was the dignity he had wanted for her. But as the spark grew, a familiar tightness coiled in her chest. The fear of failure was a cold dread, the certainty that she would try and be found wanting. A frail girl playing at a man's brutal game. Just as the flame of her resolve began to burn brightest, the traitor in her own lungs sought to extinguish it. The cough started as a tickle, then erupted into a spasm that bent her double, shaking her frame with a brutal, relentless violence. She gasped for air, her knuckles white as she clutched the edge of the table. Each ragged heave was an agonizing reminder of her own fragility. When the fit finally subsided, she was left trembling and breathless, her vision blurred with tears. The claim document lay before her, a silent testament to a future she could see, but one her own body would not let her reach. The cabin felt like a tomb, the air thick with the dust of her father's forgotten life and the ghost of her own failing breath. Pearl could not stay within its four walls a moment longer. Driven by an instinct more powerful than her weariness, she pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and slipped out into the cold twilight. She walked away from the clamor of C Street, her feet finding the familiar path that led toward the desolate edge of town, where the last ramshackle structures gave way to the vast, silent expanse of the high desert. Here, the air was thinner, sharper, and for a moment it seemed to scour the sickness from her lungs. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, a lonely sound that echoed the hollow ache inside her. He was seated upon a large, flat slab of granite, a silhouette against the deepening purple of the sky over the eastern peaks. He was so still, he might have been mistaken for a feature of the landscape itself, weathered and ancient. She had seen him before, a Lakota man whose people had been pushed from their lands further east, now living on the fringes of a town that had devoured the earth that sustained them. His presence was a quiet rebuke to the frantic, greedy energy of Virginia City. As she drew nearer, her steps faltering, he turned his head. Pearl braced herself for the look she had come to expect, the quick aversion, the flash of pity. Instead, his eyes, dark and deep-set in a face mapped with the hardships of a long life, held a steady, unnerving calm. He did not look at her as a sick girl, a fragile creature to be shunned. He looked at her as if he could see the very bones of her soul, the defiant spark that guttered and fought in the storm of her body's betrayal. He did not rise, but his voice carried on the dry air, low and resonant. "The strongest leather is not the hide that is protected from the sun and the storm," he said, his gaze unwavering. "It is the skin that has been weathered, stretched, and scarred. It holds its shape because of what it has endured." The words struck Pearl with the force of a physical blow, dismantling the architecture of her shame. He was not talking about leather. He was talking about her. All the suffering, the rejection, the agonizing weakness she saw as her curse. He was naming it a source of strength. She found her voice, a threadbare whisper. "He took my father's land." The words fell from her lips before she had even willed them, a confession of the rage and helplessness that choked her. The old man nodded slowly, his gaze shifting toward the looming shadow of Mount Davidson, now scarred with the tailings and structures of the big mining concerns. "The earth is broken," he acknowledged. "When a thing is broken, you have two paths. You can seek revenge and break another in its place. This path makes you a prisoner to the one you hate. Or," he paused, turning his dark eyes back to her, "you can seek to repair, to build something new in the place that is broken. This path is harder. It makes a foundation. It makes you free." He said nothing more, simply returning his gaze to the vast, darkening landscape. The cryptic advice settled not in Pearl's mind, but deeper, in the marrow of her bones. Repair, not revenge. The idea was a fragile seed planted in the ravaged ground of her heart. For the first time in months, the crushing sense of her own isolation eased. She was not merely a sick girl on the edge of town. She was a woman whose skin had been weathered, and in the quiet presence of this displaced elder, she felt the first faint stirrings of a purpose that might just be strong enough to hold its shape. The morning sun was a merciless anvil, hammering the dust of C Street into a fine, shimmering haze. Each step Pearl took toward the offices of the Silver Consolidated Mining Company was a small war waged against the trembling in her own limbs. The elder's words from the twilight prior formed a fragile shield around her heart. Repair, not revenge. This path makes a foundation. She clutched the claim document in her hand, the paper a brittle talisman against the monolithic arrogance of the building that now loomed before her. Its glass windows were polished to a gleam, reflecting a distorted, elongated image of her own frail form against the wild, untamed backdrop of the town. Pushing open the heavy oak door, she stepped from the cacophony of the street into a sudden, oppressive silence. The air inside was cool and still, heavy with the scent of expensive cigar smoke, oiled leather, and the crisp, metallic smell of currency. A thick Persian rug muffled her worn boots, and the walls were paneled in a dark, lustrous wood that seemed to drink the light. Behind a gleaming mahogany desk sat William McCrae. He was not a physically imposing man, but he occupied his chair, and indeed the entire room, with an air of absolute, indomitable ownership. He looked up from a ledger, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, passing over her with a brief, dismissive flicker. He gestured with a well-manicured hand toward the simple chair before his desk, a throne from which he passed judgment. Yes? His voice was smooth, yet held a bored, impatient edge. Pearl's own voice felt like a stranger in her throat, thin and reedy. Mr. McCrae, I've come about my father's claim. Jonathan McCain. She stepped forward and laid the folded paper on the vast, uncluttered expanse of his desk. McCrae did not so much as glance at it. His gaze remained fixed on her face, a slow, clinical appraisal that made her skin crawl. A faint, contemptuous smile touched the corner of his lips. My dear girl, he began, leaning back in his leather chair, which sighed in protest. You don't have the proper color for this country. All that high mountain sun, and you're as pale as a ghost. The words were a physician's diagnosis and a hangman's verdict all in one. He was not merely commenting on her health. He was declaring her unfit for survival, for contention, for the very air she was breathing in his presence. Whatever misunderstanding your father may have had, I assure you the matter is settled. Silver Consolidated holds the title to that parcel. Our filings are impeccable. The claim document lay between them, an unread testament to his lie. He would not even grant her the dignity of a proper refusal. To him, she and her paper were nothing, a momentary irritation, a speck of dust on his polished world. The humiliation was a hot, scalding thing, worse than any pity she had ever endured. But as the heat rose in her cheeks, it burned away the fear, leaving behind something hard and sharp. The ghost her father had never wanted her to be began to fade, replaced by a woman of flesh and blood and simmering rage. She said nothing. There were no words that could breach the fortress of his arrogance. She simply turned, her back straight, and walked from the suffocating quiet of his office back into the raw, living noise of the street. The bright sunlight was a shock, and the dust-laden air immediately assaulted her lungs. A cough seized her, a violent, racking tremor that bent her over and brought tears to her eyes. But when the spasm passed, she did not falter. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked on, the sound of her father's voice echoing not as a memory, but as a command. Head high, Pearl girl, head high. The Story County Records Office was a neglected back room, a repository of forgotten histories bound in cracking leather and smelling of dust and slow decay. For 3 days, Pearl had lived in its dim, shadowed light, the world outside reduced to a muffled rumble beyond a single grime-streaked window. The air, thick with the dry scent of aging paper, was a constant torment to her lungs, but she fought the irritation with a fierce, quiet will, pressing a handkerchief to her lips to stifle the coughs that threatened to betray her. She moved with a deliberate slowness, her body a constant ache, lifting the heavy ledgers from their shelves and carrying them to the small, solitary table where she worked. Time blurred into a cycle of weary effort. The sun would cast a long, dusty beam across the floor in the morning, crawl up the wall of shelves, and fade into the gray of late afternoon. She would trace the spidery ink of property transfers, her fingers smudged with black, her eyes burning from the strain. Names and dates swirled into a meaningless dance. Parcels bought, sold, consolidated. The name McCrae was a constant, dark thread weaving through the tapestry of the Comstock, absorbing smaller claims like a spreading stain. Hope, so new and fragile, began to fray with each fruitless hour. The task felt monumental, her energy finite, and despair was a patient predator circling in the shadows of the room. It was on the fourth day, when her spirit was at its lowest ebb, that she found it. It was not a grand confession or a forged signature, but something far quieter, more insidious. Tucked within a surveyor's log from 3 years prior was a map of the very sector that held her father's claim. And beside the parcel, in faint pencil, was a date of transfer to a subsidiary of Silver Consolidated. Her breath caught. She pulled out her father's document, its edges softened from her constant handling, and laid it beside the log. The date on the surveyor's map, the date McCrae's company had supposedly acquired the rights, was 6 full weeks before her father had even filed his original claim. He had not bought her father out. He had claimed land that wasn't yet his to take, using his corporate weight to retroactively legitimize the theft in the official record. The lie was not bold, but buried, a subtle poison in the ink. That evening she did not return to her cabin. She walked as if pulled by an invisible cord back to the edge of town where the granite slab sat like a silent witness. The elder was there, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if reading a story only he could see. He turned his head as she approached, his expression unreadable, but for a deep, knowing stillness. He did not speak of claims or papers. Instead, his voice, low and imbued with the dry cadence of the wind, began a story. "My grandfather's grandfather," he said, his eyes never leaving the purpled mountains, would take his sons to a spring that came from the heart of the earth. The water was life. It was a story told from the rock to the people. Then men came who did not listen to the rock. They heard only the sound of their own hammers. They put a fence around the spring and called it theirs. They had a paper that said so. He paused, the silence stretching. My people could have broken the fence. They could have shed blood on that sacred ground and made the water bitter with their hate. Instead, they found a new place to listen to the earth. They carried the story of the spring inside them. The water is gone, but the story remains. It is the story that gives us strength, not the water we lost. He fell silent, his tale finished. Pearl felt the truth of it settle over her, not as advice, but as a profound and aching parallel. Her fight was not for a parcel of dirt, but for the story of her father's hope. Her resolve, which had been a flickering ember of rage, now solidified into something cool and heavy as iron. Yet as she stood there, a sudden weakness swept through her legs, and the chill of the evening air seemed to seep directly into her bones. The story in her heart was strong, but she looked down at her hands, thin and pale in the twilight, and wondered if the vessel that held it was already broken beyond repair. The following day, the lye soap bit into the raw cracks of Pearl's knuckles with a familiar fire. She stood beside Eliza, a stout woman whose face was a roadmap of sun and worry, her arms thick with a lifetime of hard labor. The rhythm of their work was a shared, unspoken language. Plunge, scrub, wring, repeat. Between them, the steam rose like a ghost, clouding the harsh morning light. Pearl's resolve from the previous night felt a world away, a dream dreamed by a healthier, stronger woman. Here, in the relentless toil, she was only her aching back and her treacherous lungs. Yet, the elder's words echoed within her. The story is what gives us strength. She took a breath, not of air, but of courage. "Eliza," she began, her voice barely a whisper above the sloshing water. She did not stop her scrubbing. "McCrae stole my father's claim." Eliza's hands stilled for a fraction of a second, the only sign she had heard. Her gaze remained fixed on the shirt she was brutalizing against the washboard. "McCrae owns half this town, Pearl," she said, her voice low and flat. "The other half, he scares." It was not a refusal, but a statement of fact, a warning carved from the hard granite of reality. Eliza had a husband in the mines and 3 children to feed. Fear was a currency she understood better than coin. Pearl laid her proof on the damp edge of the washtub, the lie she had unearthed in the county records. He filed a claim on land that wasn't his to take. He did it weeks before my father even registered his own. The date is right here. Eliza wiped a sudsy hand on her apron and leaned closer, her eyes squinting at the faint pencil markings Pearl indicated. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the sounds of the laundry yard. Pearl could feel the woman's internal calculus, the weight of a friend's plea against the crushing weight of a powerful man's wrath. Finally, Eliza straightened up, a grim tightness around her mouth. "He cheated my Jed out of a week's pay last spring," she said, her voice hard as nails. "Said the ore was poor grade. We ate potatoes for a month." She looked from Pearl's desperate face to the distant, imposing structure of the Silver Consolidated office. It ain't right. With that simple pronouncement, a pact was forged in the steam and suds. Their alliance, however small, was a splinter of light. That afternoon they spoke to the other women, wives of miners and laborers. Rejection came swiftly and often without words. Mary Beth O'Connell, whose husband worked directly under McCrae's foreman, simply shook her head, her eyes wide with a terror that needed no explanation, and hurried away. Another woman pulled her children close, shielding them as if Pearl's quest were a contagion. The fear was a palpable thing, a cold fog that clung to the edges of the town. But two others listened. A young widow named Sarah, whose husband had been killed in a shaft collapse Silver Consolidated had deemed an act of God, and Martha, an older woman who remembered Jonathan McCain's kindness. Their support was not a battle cry, but a quiet, determined nod. It was enough. Standing with these three women, Pearl felt a piece of her own dignity, so long eroded by pity and scorn, being restored. She was not just a sick girl with a piece of paper. She was a daughter fighting for her father's name, and she was not alone. That evening, as the sky bled into shades of bruised purple and rose, she found the elder on his granite perch. He looked at her as she approached, his eyes seeming to measure the new fortitude in her posture. Before she could speak of her small victory, he gestured to a small bundle of sage beside him. "The mountain air is thin," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It asks for strong lungs. When the breath is hard, you must not fight it. You must invite it." He lit the tip of the sage bundle with a flint, and a plume of fragrant silvery smoke rose into the twilight. "Breathe the story of the earth," he instructed. "Let it fill the broken places." Hesitantly, Pearl leaned forward and inhaled the pungent smoke. It was sharp, cleansing, and for a miraculous moment, the ever-present tightness in her chest seemed to ease its grip. It was not a cure, but it was a reprieve. It was a breath. In that single, clear breath, she felt the truth of his lesson. Her weakness was a part of her, but it did not have to be the whole of her. One could be both weathered and strong, broken and whole. One could learn to stand, head high, and simply breathe. It was 2 days later when the shadow of William McCrae fell across her world, not as a whisper in a records office, but as a hulking, physical threat. The man appeared at the edge of the laundry yard, his presence a discordant note in the humid air. He was built like a mine timber, thick and unyielding, his cheap suit stretched taut across a barrel chest. He did not belong here, among the lie and steam and the quiet industry of women, and he moved with the swagger of a man who knew it and did not care. He walked directly to Pearl's station, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of alkaline dust. Eliza, seeing him approach, gave Pearl a single, wide-eyed look of terror before turning her back, her scrubbing suddenly frantic, a prayer in the form of labor. The man stopped before her, his bulk blocking the sun. He looked from the steaming tub to Pearl's face, a slow, insolent smile spreading across his own. "Heard you been poking your nose where it ain't wanted," he snarled, his voice a low gravel. He nudged her bucket of clean rinsing water with his boot, tipping it over. The water bled into the thirsty dirt, turning it to dark mud. Pearl's hands, submerged in the hot suds, clenched into fists. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, threatening to seize her breath. But beneath it, a different kind of heat began to rise, a simmering, defiant anger. She said nothing, simply lifted her chin and met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. His smile vanished. "Mr. McCrae, he's a patient man, but he don't like pests." He reached out a beefy hand and swept the neat pile of folded, laundered linens from her work table onto the muddy ground. "He especially don't like sickly little pests with useless skin that ain't good for nothing." With a final act of contempt, he planted his boot squarely in the center of her washboard, splintering the worn wood with a sharp crack. He had meant to break her. She could feel the violent trembling in her legs, the familiar tightness coiling in her chest. But as she stared at the wreckage of her small enterprise, the ruin of her father's laundered shirts lying in the filth, something inside her shifted. It was the click of a lock turning, of a door opening onto a new and frightening landscape. This was not about a paper claim anymore. This was a violation. The elder's words about repair echoed in her mind, but now they took on a different meaning. To repair a thing that was deliberately broken by another was not an act of quiet mending. It was an act of war. Justice was not a passive state. It was something you seized. The man grunted, satisfied with his work, and turned to leave. Pearl remained rooted to the spot, watching him go, the command of her father echoing with a new iron clarity. Head high. It took her the rest of that day, and all of the next, to clean the mess. She worked alone. Each time she bent to retrieve a mud-stained shirt, her back screamed in protest. Each splinter of the broken washboard she gathered felt like a sliver in her own heart. But with every methodical motion, every painstaking effort to restore order to the chaos, the fear receded, burned away by the slow, steady fire of her resolve. She was no longer a ghost, nor a sickly girl. She was weathered leather, stretched and scarred, and she was beginning, at last, to hold her shape. The thin air of the high desert felt different that evening, sharp and crystalline, as if the world had been scrubbed clean. Pearl approached the granite slab where the elder sat, a sentinel watching the last vestiges of daylight bleed from the sky. She carried the splintered wood of her washboard in her heart, a fresh and bitter wound. The desire for retribution was a hot coal in her gut, a stark contrast to the cold resolve that had settled over her. She did not need to speak of the man who had come, or the mud, or the violation. The elder turned his head, and in his dark eyes she saw he already knew the shape of her anger. "There was a man who came to the Black Hills before he came here," the elder began, his voice the low rumble of distant thunder. His gaze was fixed on the scarred face of Mount Davidson. He was young, and his hunger for the rock was a fire that burned without warmth. He dug his own tunnels, promised other men riches, but his hunger made him deaf to the groans of the earth. He dug too fast, took too much, and the mountain spoke. It took back his mine, and with it, the lives of 3 men who had trusted him. The story settled in the still air. Pearl's breath caught, a painful hitch in her chest. McCrae. It could be no other. A man who carries ghosts. The elder continued softly, will do one of 2 things. He will seek to honor them, or he will try to outrun them. This man, he builds a new mountain of silver and gold, hoping its peak will be high enough that he can no longer hear the voices from below the ground. Later that night, a relentless cough drove her from the suffocating confines of her cabin. She walked beneath a sky littered with cold, indifferent stars, the noise of C Street a dull roar ahead. The swinging doors of a saloon cast a parallelogram of golden, smoky light onto the dusty street, and there, seated alone at a corner table, was William McCrae. He was staring into a glass of whiskey as if it held the secrets to the universe. From the street, Pearl watched him, and for a moment she could see past the arrogant edifice to the man the elder had described. His eyes were not the cold steel of a conqueror, but the haunted gray of a man perpetually looking over his shoulder. He saw nothing of the raucous saloon around him. In the amber liquid he saw only the swirling dust of a collapsed tunnel, heard only the echoes of shouts that had turned to silence. His ruthless ambition was not a sword, but a shield against a memory that would consume him if he ever stood still. Pearl felt the sharp edges of her hatred soften, replaced by a complex, aching pity. The elder's words returned with newfound weight. Revenge makes you a prisoner to the one you hate. To destroy McCrae would be to chain herself to his ghosts. The path of repair, however, was a different matter. It was not for him, but for her father, for herself. As she turned away from the window, a spasm seized her lungs, harder and deeper than ever before. She leaned against the rough clapboard of the building, gasping, the pain a white-hot poker in her chest. The vessel was weakening, the breath growing thin. Yet, as she finally straightened, wiping the tears from her eyes, her purpose was no longer a question of revenge or repair. It was simply a matter of dignity. She would not stop. She would not falter. She would walk through this town with her head held high, if it was the last thing she ever did. The work began not with a battle cry, but with a whisper. Pearl and her small band of allies, Eliza, Sarah, and Martha, moved through the town like a slow, quiet tide. They spoke not in the raucous saloons, but over laundry lines and dry goods counters, in the brief shared moments of women's lives. Eliza, her face set in a grim mask of resolve, would mention the discrepancy to the baker's wife while her flour was being weighed. Sarah, whose own grief gave her a strange, untouchable courage, would speak of it to another young widow in the shade of the church. They offered the story of the claim like a carefully guarded coal from a fire, a small piece of warmth against the chill of fear that governed Virginia City. The judgment was swift. Men in McCrae's employ would stop and stare, their gazes hard and contemptuous, as Pearl walked past. A foreman spat on the boardwalk near her feet, but it was the silence of others that cut the deepest. The neighbors who suddenly found their shoes fascinating. The women who hurried their children indoors as if her quest were a plague. They were all prisoners, she realized, not of McCrae himself, but of what he represented, the power to give and the power to take away. The tension coalesced one evening in the town's main hall, a hastily called meeting to discuss water rights that quickly became a referendum on William McCrae's dominion. The room was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and cheap tobacco. On one side stood McCrae's men, confident and sneering. On the other, a larger, more hesitant crowd of miners and merchants shifted on their feet, their faces etched with a mixture of resentment and fear. Pearl stood near the back with Eliza, her presence a silent accusation. When the floor was opened, a miner named Finn, his face prematurely aged by rock dust and sun, rose to his feet. "We hear things," he said, his voice rough but clear, refusing to look at McCrae's foreman. "We hear about claims being misplaced, about honest men being cheated." A low murmur went through the room. The foreman stepped forward. "Watch your mouth, Finn. You're talking about bad luck, not bad business." "I'm talking about Jonathan McCain's girl," Finn countered, his gaze finally finding Pearl. He nodded, a small gesture of profound respect. "She ain't crying for charity. She's asking for what's right. There's a dignity in that." The room fell silent. It was not a declaration of war, but a line drawn in the dust. The meeting dissolved without resolution, but something had irrevocably shifted. The fear had not vanished, but it now had a counterbalance, a shared sense of injustice, given a name and a face. Later, in the quiet solitude of her cabin, Pearl sat by the light of a single lamp. The weight of her father's story felt heavier than ever, but it was no longer just his. It was Finn's, and Eliza's, and Sarah's. With a hand that trembled from exhaustion, she dipped a pen in ink and began to write on a sheet of butcher paper. A claim of right. She wrote out the facts, the dates, the quiet lie she had found buried in the county ledger. Each carefully formed letter was an act of defiance, a physical drain on her meager strength. This paper was not for a judge or a lawyer. It was for the men like Finn. She was not just fighting for a deed. She was forging a new legacy from the splinters of the old, one that said a person's dignity was worth more than the silver in a mountain. The nail was cold and rough beneath her thumb as she pressed the corner of the butcher paper against the public notice board outside the general store. The words she had written, a claim of right, seemed both bold and terrifyingly fragile under the unrelenting glare of the Virginia city sun. A small crowd had gathered at a cautious distance, drawn by the audacity of her act. She could feel their collective gaze, the wary curiosity of men like Finn, the cold contempt of those loyal to McCrae, the nervous pity of the rest. Each hammer tap driving the nail into the wood echoed the frantic beat of her own heart. A shadow fell over her, so sudden and complete it was as if the sun had been eclipsed. The murmuring of the crowd died, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Pearl did not need to turn to know who stood behind her. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, thick with the scent of his expensive cigars and indomitable will. William McCrae had come. "This is a sad spectacle, Miss McCain." His voice was a low, controlled sound, meant for her but carrying to every listening ear. He stepped around to face her, his winter sky eyes sweeping over her work with disdain before settling on her face. A public tantrum over a piece of worthless rock. He reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch that chinked with the sound of gold coin. He held it out to her. "Here, $200, more than your father's fantasy was ever worth. Take it and go somewhere the air is kinder. This mountain, it doesn't give, child. It only takes." His gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, a cloud passing over his features. The confident mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the haunted man beneath. "I've given enough to the rock in this place," he muttered, the words more to himself than to her. "I won't have another ghost on my hands." He was not speaking of her father. He was speaking of the men buried in the earth, the specters he tried to outrun by building his empire ever higher. The pouch of gold hung in the air between them, a bribe meant to silence her, to buy her dignity. But in his momentary lapse she saw not a monster, but a man imprisoned by his own past. The hot coal of her anger cooled into something far more powerful, clarity. She looked from the coins to his haunted eyes, and her own resolve hardened into steel. "It was never about the money, Mr. McCrae," she said, her voice thin but unwavering in the sudden hush. "This is about repair. You can't put a price on a man's name, or the hope he leaves his daughter." As she spoke, the traitor in her chest rebelled. A tickle became a clawing need for air, and the cough seized her, a brutal full-bodied spasm that bent her double. She clutched the rough wood of the notice board, her knuckles white, each ragged gasp a public spectacle of her body's failure. A wave of shame and helplessness washed over her. Through watery eyes, she saw McCrae's expression harden, his brief vulnerability replaced with contemptuous certainty. He saw only weakness, a final, pathetic surrender. But the elder's words were a foundation beneath her feet. The strongest leather, weathered, stretched, and scarred. Slowly, agonizingly, she straightened. She drew a shuddering breath that scraped her lungs raw and lifted her head. She met McCrae's gaze, her own eyes clear and fierce despite the tears that tracked through the dust on her cheeks. "You will not make a ghost of me," she finished, her voice a raw whisper that was somehow louder than all the noise of the street. "I will have what is right, with my head high." She did not wait for a response, leaving the pouch of gold untouched, a silent testament to her refusal. She turned and walked away. The crowd parted before her, their expressions no longer pitying, but filled with a stunned, reluctant respect. Each step was an agony, but her back was straight, and she did not falter. The courtroom was a box built to suffocate hope. The air, thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and the collective anxiety of men, was a physical weight on Pearl's chest. High, grime-streaked windows let in slanted beams of dusty light that illuminated the dark, imposing wood of Judge Alistair Blackwood's bench. Blackwood himself was a man carved from the same hard material, his face a mask of stern impatience, his gaze moving between the two sides as if weighing not evidence, but influence. On one side, William McCrae sat flanked by a slick, city-bred lawyer whose arguments were a blizzard of legal jargon and condescending dismissals. On the other sat Pearl, with Eliza and Sarah beside her, a small, homespun trinity of defiance. For 2 days the battle had been waged. McCrae's lawyer presented a mountain of paperwork, his voice a smooth, confident drone about corporate filings and binding precedents. Then Pearl, her own voice a thin reed in the cavernous room, laid out her simple, damning truth, pointing to the dates that proved the lie. She could feel the judge's skepticism, see the way his eyes kept drifting back to the undeniable power and wealth seated at McCrae's table. In this room the truth felt fragile, a whisper against a hurricane. A courtroom sketch artist, a gaunt man in the corner, chronicled the proceedings, his charcoal scratching on the paper a dry, rhythmic counterpoint to Pearl's faltering breath. The stack of finished drawings grew beside him, each a frozen moment of her struggle, her pointing finger, McCrae's bored smirk, the judge's stony profile. On the third day, as Judge Blackwood cleared his throat to deliver what Pearl knew would be a dismissal, the heavy courtroom doors swung open. A profound silence fell as the elder entered. He moved not with haste, but with a deliberate grace that commanded the space more effectively than any gavel. His worn moccasins made no sound on the floorboards. He was a piece of the weathered ancient landscape that had trespassed into this sterile chamber of man's law, and his presence was a quiet, powerful rebuke. Judge Blackwood stared, his impatience momentarily replaced by a deep, weary curiosity. "Does this man have something to add?" he asked, his voice losing some of its edge. The elder did not look at the judge. He looked at Pearl, then at McCrae, his dark eyes holding a deep and sorrowful knowledge. When he spoke, his voice was low and resonant, the sound of wind over dry rock. "A man's name is not a word," he began. "It is the story of his father and his father's father. When he leaves a mark upon the earth, he is not claiming dirt. He is leaving a piece of that story for his child to find, so they will know who they are and where they come from." His gaze settled on McCrae, and it was not an accusation, but a statement of profound pity. There are those who steal the stories of others because their own story is a ghost that haunts them. They think if they build a new story, a mountain of silver and shining glass, its shadow will be large enough to hide the graves they carry. A muscle jumped in McCrae's jaw. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind the pallor of a man seeing a specter in the daylight. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was the young, desperate man in the elder's tale, forever trapped in a tunnel of his own making. The words settled in the silent room, a truth far older and heavier than any legal statute. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, the mask of judicial indifference finally cracking. He looked from McCrae's haunted face to Pearl's, and for the first time he truly saw her, not as a sickly pest, but as the keeper of a stolen story. A fierce, impossible hope surged in Pearl's chest, so potent it felt like a fresh wound. The sudden joy was an agony, and the strain of the long days, the foul air, the crushing weight of it all, conspired against her. A cough, deep and racking, tore through her, doubling her over. But as her ally's hand steadied her, she raised her head, her watery eyes fixed on the judge. She was broken, but she was still there. And in the judge's transformed expression, she saw that the story, at last, had been heard. Judge Alistair Blackwood picked up his gavel, the polished wood feeling unnaturally heavy in his hand. The courtroom was a vacuum, all sound and air sucked out by the weight of the elder's story. The judge looked at William McCrae, who for the first time appeared not as a pillar of the community, but as a man hollowed out by his own ambition, his face a mask of ashen disbelief. Then his gaze shifted to Pearl. He saw the tremble in her thin frame, the translucent pallor of her skin, but he also saw the fierce, unbreakable light in her eyes. The law was a rigid thing, but justice, he now understood, was a living story. The law recognizes the sanctity of a filed claim. The judge began, his voice cutting through the silence, each word landing with the finality of a hammer blow. It also recognizes intent. The evidence presented, corroborated by the sequence of filings, shows a deliberate and preemptive action by the Silver Consolidated Mining Company to secure land to which it had no prior right. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Pearl McCain. The claim filed by her father, Jonathan McCain, is hereby declared valid and sole title. A collective gasp swept through the room. McCrae shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. His face was a thundercloud of pure, unadulterated fury. The mask was gone. All that remained was the raw, rapacious hunger that had driven him for years, now thwarted by a ghost and a sick girl. "This is an outrage," he roared, his voice cracking. "A farce built on sentiment." He did not look at the judge. He stared at Pearl, his eyes burning with a hatred that was cold as ice. He saw her not as a victor, but as one more specter he had failed to outrun. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed from the courtroom, slamming the heavy oak doors behind him with a boom that shook the dust from the rafters. He was defeated, but utterly unrepentant, already building a wall of rage around the new wound to his pride. For Pearl, the sound of the slamming door seemed to come from a great distance. Victory rushed into the void left by years of fear and despair, a tidal wave of emotion so overwhelming it threatened to drown her. Eliza's hand was on her shoulder, squeezing with joy. Sarah was weeping silently beside her. A cheer went up from Finn and the other miners in the back. The story had been heard. Her father's name was restored. The relief was a physical thing, a sudden release of a tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it was like to be without it. And then, the strings that had held her taut, upright form together simply snapped. The faces of her friends blurred, the jubilant sounds of the courtroom warping and fading into a dull roar. A veil of blackness crept in at the edges of her vision. Her lungs, which had fought so valiantly for every breath, surrendered. There was no air, only a crushing weight. She felt herself pitching forward, a rag doll with its stuffing pulled out, into the welcoming, silent dark. She awoke to the scent of sage and the cool, dry air of dusk. She was lying on a pallet near the granite slab, her head resting on a folded blanket. The elder sat nearby, his silhouette outlined against a sky of deep violet. He did not speak, but she felt his quiet presence like a balm. The victory in the courtroom felt like a dream. The silver was hers. But as she lay there, the familiar ache in her chest, a dull, constant reminder of her frailty, she knew the rock and the silver were not the true prize. "The mountain has given you back the story," the elder said softly, his gaze on the first stars pricking the twilight. "What will you do with it?" It was not about a mine. It was not about wealth or power or walking through town with her head held high in defiance of one man. It was about all the others. The ones who, like her, were seen as unfit, whose bodies were a burden, whose breath was a struggle. Her legacy would not be a new mountain of silver to rival McCrae's. It would be a shelter, a place of clean air and care, a place for broken bodies to find repair. In the quiet of the high desert, fear finally gave way to purpose, and Pearl McCain, owner of a silver vein, chose not to dig, but to build. The seasons turned, chasing one another across the high desert peaks. Summer's brutal heat gave way to the crisp, golden melancholy of autumn, and then the deep, silent cold of winter blanketed the mountain in white. Through it all, the sound of hammers and saws became the new pulse of Virginia City. The silver that flowed from her father's claim did not vanish into a bank vault. It was transmuted into timber, brick, and mortar. Pearl stood on a small rise overlooking the work, a wool shawl wrapped tight against the chill, her breath pluming in the thin air. The incessant grinding labor of the laundry yard was a memory from another lifetime. Now, her work was to watch, to direct, to will this new thing into existence. The men, many of whom had once averted their eyes from her in pity or scorn, now tipped their hats as she passed. She was no longer a sickly ghost haunting the town's periphery, but the quiet, unshakable center of its most hopeful enterprise. She watched as a bricklayer, his hands chapped and gray with mortar, expertly tapped another brick into place. The wall was rising, solid and true, built upon the stone foundation that had once been the floor of William McCrae's mining office. She could still see the phantom outline of his desk, the spot where he had looked at her with such contempt, declaring her unfit. She was not tearing down his monument of greed. She was building upon its ruins, turning a place of violation into a place of healing. This, she knew, was the very heart of repair. A sudden gust of wind swirled up from the construction site, carrying the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut pine and the fine grit of sawdust. Pearl braced herself by instinct, her body anticipating the familiar clawing seizure in her chest, but it did not come. Cautiously, she drew a breath. It was still a conscious effort, a negotiation with her own body, but the air that filled her lungs felt different. It was cleaner, less burdened, and the painful tightness that had been her constant companion for years had eased its grip. It was not a cure, but it was reprieve. It was space. It was hope inhaled. Miss McCain, Finn, the miner who had spoken for her, now served as her foreman. He approached her holding a rolled blueprint, his face earnest, the old resentment in his eyes replaced with a deep, abiding respect. The glaziers have arrived with the glass for the sun porch. They say it's larger than specified, but I told them it was your intention, to let in as much light as possible. Pearl looked from the rising walls to the vast open sky. She thought of all the others who fought for each breath in dusty cabins and crowded boarding houses. Yes, Finn, she said, her voice quiet but firm, carrying easily on the cold air. That was my intention. Tell them to begin. We want all the light we can get. He nodded, a man receiving not an order, but a piece of a shared vision. As he walked away, Pearl lifted her face to the sun. Her head was high, not with the defiant pride of a victor, but with the simple, profound dignity of a woman building a place for the weathered and the broken to finally breathe. The day dawned with a crystalline clarity unique to the high desert, the sun casting long, gentle shadows from the peaks. Before the new building, a crowd had gathered, a quiet and solemn assembly, unlike the boisterous gatherings of C Street. The structure itself was a testament to a different kind of wealth. Its walls of pale brick and timbers of light pine seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than hoard it. Great, clear panes of glass formed a long sun porch facing east, designed to drink in the morning light and hold its warmth against the cold. The air smelled not of greed and stale smoke, but of fresh paint, pine sap, and the clean, hopeful scent of possibility. Pearl stood before them all, a simple linen cord in her hand. The cord led up to a canvas sheet covering the new sign above the door. She was still slender, still possessed of a fragility that hinted at the battles waged within her own body, but she stood with a newfound stillness, her shoulders straight, her head held high not in defiance, but in quiet ownership. At the front of the crowd were the sanatorium's first residents, faces she recognized from the town's periphery. A young miner with the telltale pallor, an older woman who always held a handkerchief to her mouth. They were the ghosts she had once been, and she met their gazes with a profound, shared understanding. She pulled the cord. The canvas slid away with a soft whisper, revealing the sign. The letters were carved simply into the wood. The McCain Respite. It was not a monument to a fortune, but a promise of rest. A murmur went through the crowd, a sound of quiet approbation. One of the miners, a young man no older than 20, stepped forward, his hat clutched in his hands. "Miss McCain," he said, his voice husky with emotion. We thought we were just dust to be swept away. His gaze was one of profound, life-altering gratitude. "Thank you for seeing us." The words landed in her heart, sealing the last of the cracks left by years of shame. His words were the very ones she had thought about herself, a perfect and healing echo. An older woman beside him simply nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears, a look that conveyed more than a torrent of words ever could. Pearl felt a loosening in her own chest, a release so deep it felt as if a band of iron had finally rusted through. She took a breath, and it was the easiest breath she had taken in her life. It filled her lungs without a fight, cool, clean, and full of the promise of the day. Her gaze drifted past the faces, to the edge of the crowd where the elder stood. He watched her, his own face impassive, but his eyes held the deep, knowing calm she had first seen by the granite slab. He saw the building, he saw the grateful faces, and he saw the woman who had learned to repair a story rather than avenge it. He gave a single, slow nod, a final, silent acknowledgement that her legacy was secured. It was not a mountain of silver, but a shelter from the storm. It was not a claim on the earth, but a claim on human dignity. And in that quiet, sun-drenched moment, Pearl knew she had built something that would truly last. The sun porch of the McCain Respite was a vessel filled with light. Here, men who had once choked on rock dust now sat in comfortable chairs, reading newspapers or simply watching the slow drift of clouds over the peaks. Their breathing was the quietest sound in the room, a gentle tide of life rising and falling. Pearl watched from the doorway, her heart a placid lake where once a storm had raged. She saw her own past reflected in their peaceful faces, the fear, the isolation, the shame of a body that had betrayed them. She had believed her weakness was a curse, a sign she was unfit for this harsh world. But she had been wrong. Her fragility had not been an obstacle to her strength. It had been the source of it. It had forged in her an empathy that a titan like McCrae, walled within his own ambition, could never possess. This was the final, profound truth of her journey. Justice was not about punishing the wicked, but about repairing what they had broken. It was about building a shelter in the place a fortress once stood. Her story, a quiet tale from a dusty corner of the world, reveals a truth that echoes in every heart that has ever felt small or cast aside. If Pearl's journey moved you, if you believe that the deepest vulnerabilities can forge the most profound strengths, then subscribe and ring the bell. Join us and become one of those who are dedicated to turning exclusion into care. Together, we will continue to celebrate the beautiful, weathered texture of our differences, and we will uplift our communities with every story we share of dignity, legacy, and the enduring power of repair.